The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Not the gentle kind that makes you want to curl up with a book, but the heavy, relentless type that turns roads into rivers and makes everyone nervous about what might happen next. In a quiet hillside community just outside the city, construction workers showed up that morning like they had for the past 6 months. They were building new homes on land that overlooked the valley below. It was supposed to be a luxury development with million-dollar views, but nature had other plans. When the crew arrived at 7 in the morning, they immediately knew something was wrong. A massive chunk of the hillside had given way during the night. Mud, rocks, and debris covered what used to be a neat construction site. Trees that had stood for decades were now lying on their sides, their roots exposed to the sky. The foreman stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, calculating how many days this would set them back. His crew gathered around, staring at the mess. Nobody was excited about spending the day in the rain shoveling mud, but they had a job to do. The excavator operator climbed into his machine around 8:30. He'd been doing this work for almost 15 years and had seen his share of mudslides. This one was bad, but not the worst. He started clearing the debris, carefully moving the heavy equipment across the unstable ground. Around mid-morning, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a large rock or maybe an old water tank buried in the hillside. But as he cleared more mud away, he realized it was metal. Rusted, twisted metal that didn't belong there. He stopped the machine and climbed down to get a closer look. The rain was still coming down, making it hard to see clearly. He called over his supervisor, and together they brushed away some of the mud with their gloves. That's when they saw it. A license plate. Barely readable under all the rust and grime, but definitely a license plate. They'd found a car, or what was left of one. The supervisor immediately called the foreman, who came running over. Within minutes, work on the site stopped completely. Everyone gathered around the partially buried vehicle, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The car wasn't just old. It was ancient by car standards, probably from the 90s based on its shape. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was where it was. This vehicle was buried under at least 20 feet of earth and vegetation. It hadn't ended up here recently. This had happened a long time ago. The foreman made the call everyone knew he had to make. Within 40 minutes, police cars started arriving at the site. Then came the investigators. Then the crime scene unit. Yellow tape went up around the area. Workers were told to stay back and keep away from the excavation zone. Some of them stood under a temporary shelter, drinking coffee and watching as specialists in white suits began the careful process of exposing more of the vehicle. It took hours. The rain didn't help, but slowly, methodically, they revealed more of the car. It was a sedan, crushed and mangled from what must have been a terrible impact. The front end was completely destroyed. The windows were long gone. Inside, mud had filled every space. One of the detectives, a woman who'd been with the department for 20 years, stood near the vehicle taking notes. She'd seen a lot in her career, but there was something about this scene that gave her chills. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the isolation of the location. Or maybe it was the feeling that they were about to uncover something that had been hidden for far too long. As the afternoon wore on, the forensic team made another discovery. Inside the vehicle, they found personal belongings. A purse remarkably preserved in a sealed compartment. Some clothing, and then what everyone had been dreading but expecting, human remains. The construction workers who'd started their day thinking about foundation work and building schedules were now witnesses to what was clearly a major investigation. Some of them sat in their trucks, others stood in small groups talking quietly about what this could mean. The detective opened the purse carefully, her gloved hands moving slowly through the contents. There was a wallet inside. She pulled out a driver's license, though it was faded and water-damaged. She had to hold it up to the light to read it properly. When she saw the name, her hand froze. She read it again, not quite believing what she was seeing. Then she turned to her partner, her face pale despite years of experience keeping her emotions in check. The name on that license belonged to someone the detective remembered. Everyone in the city over a certain age would remember. It was a name that had been in the news constantly, 22 years ago. A name that had been on missing person posters in every shop window and police station. A name that had become synonymous with one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in the region, Diana Marquez. The actress who had simply vanished one night and was never seen again. The detective had been just starting her career when Diana disappeared. She remembered the massive search efforts, the press conferences, the desperate pleas from the family. She remembered how the case had consumed the department for months, then years before eventually going cold, and now, here she was standing in the rain on a muddy hillside, looking at what might finally be the answer to where Diana had gone. News travels fast, especially news like this. By late afternoon, media vans started arriving. Reporters set up outside the police tape, their cameras pointed at the excavation site. Helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing aerial footage of the scene. The construction foreman gave a brief statement to the press, explaining how his crew had made the discovery. He looked shaken, still processing what his team had stumbled upon. Back at the police station, senior investigators were already pulling old case files from storage. Boxes and boxes of documents, photographs, interview transcripts, and evidence logs from the original investigation into Diana's disappearance. Officers who'd worked the case back then, now retired, started receiving phone calls asking them to come in and help with the new investigation. As evening fell and the rain finally began to ease, the forensic team carefully transported the remains and evidence from the site. The car would stay there overnight, covered with tarps and guarded by officers until it could be properly removed the next day. The construction site, which had been full of noise and activity that morning, now sat silent except for the sound of generators powering the lights that had been set up around the vehicle. Tomorrow would bring more answers. Forensic analysis, official identifications, and the long process of figuring out exactly what had happened on this hillside over 2 decades ago. But tonight, one thing was already becoming clear. A mystery that had haunted an entire community for 22 years might finally be close to being solved. And it had taken nothing more than 3 days of rain and a landslide to reveal the truth. 22 years earlier, Diana Marquez was living the life most people only dream about. At 28 years old, she'd landed a recurring role on one of the hottest shows on television. Not the lead, but important enough that people were starting to recognize her face when she walked down the street. She'd moved to Los Angeles 5 years before that, like thousands of other hopeful actors do every year. The difference was Diana had something special. Not just talent, though she had plenty of that. She had this presence on camera that made you pay attention. When she was in a scene, you couldn't look away. Her agent had told her that big things were coming. There was talk of her character getting a bigger storyline next season. A few movie producers had asked about her availability. Everything was finally falling into place after years of struggling, of working as a waitress between auditions, of wondering if she'd made a huge mistake leaving her hometown. The night she disappeared started like any other work night. The cast and crew had wrapped filming for the week, and someone on the production team had organized a small party at a house in the Hollywood Hills. Nothing too crazy, just colleagues unwinding after a long week of 14-hour days. Diana almost didn't go. She'd told her best friend on the phone earlier that day that she was exhausted and just wanted to go home, feed her cat, and sleep until noon the next day. But her co-star had convinced her. Just for an hour, he'd said. Show your face, have one drink, then you can leave. So she went. People who were at that party would later tell investigators that Diana seemed fine, maybe a little tired, but that was normal for everyone working on the show. She'd arrived around 9 in the evening, wearing jeans and a simple sweater. Nothing fancy. She'd mingled, laughed at someone's stories about a scene that had gone wrong that week, and had one glass of wine. But a few people noticed something else. Diana kept checking her phone, more than usual, and each time she looked at it, her expression would change, like something in those messages was bothering her. Around 11 that night, she'd told people she was heading out. Early by Hollywood party standards, but not unusual for Diana. She'd always been professional, always made sure she got enough sleep and showed up prepared. That's what people liked about working with her. She'd hugged a few friends goodbye, grabbed her jacket from the coat rack near the door, and walked out into the foggy October night. Several people watched her walk to her car, get in, and drive away. That was the last time anyone saw Diana Marquez alive. The next morning, when she didn't show up on set, people assumed she was running late. Traffic in Los Angeles can turn a 20-minute drive into a 2-hour nightmare. Her scene wasn't scheduled until 10 anyway, so nobody panicked right away. But when 10 o'clock came and went with no Diana and no phone call, the assistant director started trying to reach her. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same thing. By 11, people were getting worried. This wasn't like her at all. The production assistant they sent to her apartment knocked on the door for 10 minutes before the building manager came with a key. What they found inside made everyone's blood run cold. Everything was exactly as Diana had left it the morning before. Her bed was made. Dishes from breakfast were still in the sink. Her cat was crying, hungry and confused about why nobody had fed him, and Diana's car was nowhere to be found. That's when the calls to police started. That's when what should have been a normal Friday turned into the beginning of a mystery that would haunt everyone who knew her. The investigation that followed was massive. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd been at the party. They talked to the cast and crew. They went through Diana's apartment looking for anything that might explain where she'd gone. They pulled her phone records, checked her bank accounts, talked to her family back home. Her mother flew in from Texas, her eyes red from crying, begging the police to find her daughter. Diana's father, who'd passed away when she was a teenager, wasn't there to help search. It was just her mother, her younger brother, and a handful of close friends, all trying to make sense of the impossible. The police found that Diana had called her mother at 11:47 that night, just after leaving the party. It had been a quick conversation. Diana had told her mom she was tired and driving home. Everything was fine. She loved her and would call again over the weekend. A completely normal conversation. Nothing in her voice suggested anything was wrong. That call became even more haunting because it meant Diana had been alive and seemingly safe, less than an hour after leaving the party. So what had happened between that phone call and her disappearance? Investigators searched the route between the Hollywood Hills and Diana's apartment in the valley. They checked every side street, every parking lot, every possible place a car might have ended up. They brought in search dogs. They even had helicopters flying over the area with thermal cameras. Nothing. The media coverage was intense. Diana's face was everywhere. On the news every night, on missing person posters in every store window, on billboards along major highways. The show she'd been working on aired a special message at the end of each episode, asking anyone with information to come forward. Tips poured in by the hundreds. People claimed to have seen her in different cities, different states, even different countries. Each one had to be checked out. Each one led nowhere. Some people theorized she'd been kidnapped. Others thought maybe she'd run away to escape some hidden problem in her life. There were whispers about debts, about a secret boyfriend, about family issues. But none of it held up under investigation. Diana had been happy. She'd been excited about her career. She'd been making plans for the future. Her friends refused to believe she would just leave. One of her co-stars broke down crying during a press conference, pleading for whoever had taken Diana to let her go. The whole thing was heartbreaking to watch. As weeks turned into months, the active search began to wind down. Police still worked the case, but with no new leads, there wasn't much they could do. The media moved on to other stories. The show eventually recast Diana's role with another actress. Life, as it always does, continued, but Diana's family never stopped hoping. Her mother kept her daughter's apartment exactly as it was for 2 full years, convinced Diana would come walking through the door with some explanation for where she'd been. Even when she finally had to give up the apartment, she kept all of Diana's belongings in storage. Just in case, the case officially went cold after 5 years. Detectives moved on to other investigations. The massive file of witness statements and evidence logs got boxed up and sent to storage. Diana Marquez became another name on a long list of people who'd vanished without a trace. But people didn't forget. Every few years, a true crime show would cover her disappearance. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries kept her case alive. Amateur detectives would propose new theories about what might have happened that foggy October night. Her mother would sometimes give interviews on the anniversary of Diana's disappearance. She'd aged visibly, the stress of not knowing taking its toll. She'd always end these interviews the same way, looking directly into the camera and saying that she just wanted to bring her daughter home. That's all. Just bring her home. For 22 years, that's where things stood. A question mark. A mystery with no ending. A family with no closure. Until a rainy morning on a construction site changed everything. The forensic lab had never been busier. What used to be a cold case gathering dust in a storage facility was now the top priority for every department. Specialists who'd gone home that first night thinking about the discovery couldn't sleep. They kept seeing that rusted car in their minds, thinking about the young woman who'd been inside it for over 2 decades. The remains were treated with the utmost care and respect. Every step was documented, every piece of evidence cataloged. This wasn't just another case to these investigators. Many of them remembered when Diana first disappeared. Some had even worked on the original investigation as young officers just starting their careers. The dental records came back within 48 hours. It was her, Diana Marquez. The confirmation everyone expected but still hit hard. After 22 years of questions, they finally had a definitive answer about what happened to the missing actress. But knowing where she was didn't answer the bigger question. How did she end up on that mountain road? The lead detective brought out the old case files and spread them across a conference room table. Boxes and boxes of documents, photographs, maps with search areas marked in red. He'd been a rookie when Diana disappeared, assigned to interview potential witnesses. Now he was leading the investigation into her death. Looking at those old files with fresh eyes revealed something interesting. Something that should have been obvious but got lost in the chaos of the original investigation. The search teams 22 years ago had focused almost entirely on the direct route between the Hollywood Hills party location and Diana's apartment in the valley. That made sense. It's where anyone would assume she'd driven, but the mountain road where her car was found wasn't on that road at all. It was a winding, dangerous stretch of pavement that went in almost the opposite direction. There was no logical reason for Diana to be there that night, unless she wasn't trying to go home, unless she was going somewhere else entirely. The detective pulled up old maps of the area. Back when Diana disappeared, that mountain road was even less developed than it is now. No houses nearby, no businesses. Just steep cliffs, sharp turns, and a view of the city lights far below. It was the kind of road locals avoided at night, especially in fog. The question became obvious. Why would Diana have driven there? The forensic team examining the vehicle found some answers. The damage pattern told a story. The car had gone over the edge of the road at high speed. It hadn't just rolled gently down the slope. It had tumbled violently, hitting rocks and trees on the way down. The impact would have been devastating, but what caused her to go over the edge? There were no skid marks documented in the original search of that road, but that didn't mean much. A light rain had fallen the morning after Diana disappeared, and any evidence on the road surface would have washed away within hours. One of the forensic investigators, a woman who specialized in accident reconstruction, studied the photos of the vehicle carefully. She noticed something interesting about the steering column. It was bent in a way that suggested Diana had been gripping the wheel hard, possibly trying to control the car when it went over. This wasn't someone who'd fallen asleep at the wheel. Something had happened that made her lose control. The team started looking into the condition of that road 22 years ago. County records showed it had been on a list for repairs but hadn't been updated yet. There were documented complaints about poor visibility, especially in fog. A few minor accidents had occurred there in the years before Diana's disappearance, though nothing as serious as going over the edge. Meanwhile, other investigators were reviewing Diana's phone records again. Technology had come a long way in 22 years. Data that was hard to analyze back then could now be processed much more efficiently. They discovered something the original investigation had either missed or hadn't considered important. After Diana's call to her mother at 11:47, there were 3 more incoming calls to her phone. All from the same number, a burner phone, purchased with cash at a convenience store, impossible to trace to a specific person. The first call came at 11:52, lasting only 30 seconds. The second at 12:03, lasting about a minute. The third at 12:14, and this one lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes is a long conversation. Long enough to convince someone to do something. Long enough to give directions. Long enough to arrange a meeting. The last location ping from Diana's phone came from a cell tower that covered the mountain road area. The timestamp was 12:41 in the morning, less than an hour after she'd left the party, telling everyone she was going home. This changed everything. Diana hadn't gotten lost. She'd deliberately driven to that isolated location. The question was why, and who had been on the other end of those phone calls. The detective remembered something from the original case files. He dug through the boxes until he found what he was looking for. A statement from Diana's best friend, given 3 days after the disappearance. She'd mentioned that Diana had seemed distracted in the weeks before she vanished, that she'd received some strange letters from a fan that had made her uncomfortable. Back then, celebrity fan mail was considered normal. Unless there were explicit threats, it wasn't taken too seriously. Diana had never filed a police report about a stalker. She'd never mentioned feeling unsafe, so the fan letters had been noted in the file but never fully investigated. Now those letters took on new significance. The detective ordered the evidence boxes from storage. Everything that had been collected from Diana's apartment, including a stack of letters that had been in her bedroom drawer. Going through them was tedious work. Most were harmless notes from fans telling her they loved her work on the show. But about a dozen letters stood out. They were different, more personal, more intense. They talked about destiny and connection and how the writer felt they understood Diana in a way nobody else could. The letters weren't signed with a full name, just initials, and they'd been sent over a period of about 4 months before Diana disappeared. The tone of the letters changed as time went on. The earlier ones were almost romantic, talking about admiration and respect. The later ones became more possessive, more demanding. One letter, dated 2 weeks before Diana vanished, mentioned meeting her, talked about a place where they could be alone, away from the cameras and the crowds, a place where the city lights looked like stars below. The detective stood at the window of the police station, looking out at the city. Then he pulled up a photo on his computer, a picture taken from that mountain road, looking down at the valley below, the city lights spreading out like a blanket of stars. This was the place. This was where whoever wrote those letters had wanted to meet Diana, and somehow, they'd convinced her to drive there in the middle of the night. But was it a stalker she was running from, or someone she thought she could trust? Had she gone there willingly, or had she been lured? The letters suggested obsession, but not necessarily violence. Yet something had gone terribly wrong on that mountain road. The team started searching for anyone who might match the profile of the letter writer. They looked at everyone who'd worked on the show, everyone who'd been at the party, everyone Diana had interacted with in those final months. They cross-referenced names with handwriting samples from the letters, though that kind of analysis wasn't as definitive as people thought. They also looked into the possibility that Diana had been fleeing, that she'd realized she was in danger and tried to escape, taking the mountain road to lose whoever was following her. The high speed at which she'd been driving suggested panic. The fact that she'd gone over the edge on such a dangerous road suggested she wasn't familiar with it, wasn't being careful, was focused on something else. Maybe looking in her rearview mirror instead of watching the road ahead. What investigators knew for certain was this. Diana had received calls from an untraceable phone. She'd driven to an isolated location that matched a description in letters from someone obsessed with her. She'd died in a violent crash on a road she had no reason to be on. Whether she'd gone to meet someone or to escape someone, they might never know for sure. But one thing was becoming clear. Diana's disappearance wasn't random. It wasn't just bad luck or getting lost in the fog. Someone had led her to that mountain road. And that someone had answers the investigators desperately wanted to find. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired detective who'd worked the original case saw the news coverage and called the station. He was in his 70s now, living in Arizona, but he remembered something that had bothered him 22 years ago. Something he'd never been able to prove. There had been a guy, a production assistant on the show, quiet, kept to himself mostly, but the detective remembered catching him watching Diana on set once, during a routine interview sweep. Not just watching, staring, with this intensity that made the detective uncomfortable. When they'd questioned him back then, he'd seemed nervous, but that wasn't unusual. Everyone was nervous talking to police. He'd said he barely knew Diana, just saw her on set like everyone else. His alibi for the night she disappeared was that he'd been home alone. Not great, but not suspicious enough to pursue further when they had dozens of other leads to follow. The detective had written down the name in his personal notes. He'd kept those notes all these years in a box in his garage. Now he was reading that name over the phone to the current investigators. Within an hour, they had a file pulled up, the guy's full background, where he'd lived, where he'd worked, everything they could find. And that's when things got interesting. He'd moved away from Los Angeles about 6 months after Diana disappeared. Sudden resignation from the show. No forwarding address left with the production company. He'd basically vanished from the industry entirely. For someone working in Hollywood trying to build a career, that was strange. People don't just walk away unless they have a reason. The investigators tracked his movements over the years. He'd bounced around different states, different jobs, never staying anywhere too long. Never working in entertainment again. And then 8 years ago he'd died in a car accident in Oregon. Single vehicle crash on a rainy night. No other cars involved. Dead ends are frustrating in any investigation, but this one felt particularly cruel. Here was someone who fit the profile, who'd had the opportunity, who'd disappeared from Los Angeles right after Diana did, and he was gone, unable to answer any questions. But dead doesn't mean forgotten. The team started digging into everything they could find about this man. They contacted the storage facility where his belongings had been kept after his death. Most of it had been disposed of years ago when the storage fees stopped being paid. But they got the inventory list of what had been there. Among his possessions had been several boxes of personal papers. Those had been thrown away, but the storage manager remembered them because she'd had to sort through everything. She told investigators that one box had been full of old magazines and newspaper clippings. Entertainment stuff. Articles about TV shows and actors. That detail alone wouldn't mean much. Lots of people who work in entertainment keep industry magazines. But she remembered something else. There had been a lot of articles about one specific show, Diana's show, and a lot of photos of one specific actress. The investigators pulled every piece of information they could find about this man's background. They looked at his bank records from 22 years ago. One transaction stood out. 3 days before Diana disappeared, he'd made a cash withdrawal of $500 for someone living paycheck to paycheck. Working as a production assistant, that was significant money. They found the convenience store where the burner phone had been purchased. The store was still there under different ownership now, but the new owner had kept some old records in the back storage. Security camera footage was long gone, but sales receipts had been boxed up and saved for tax purposes. They found it. A receipt for a prepaid phone, purchased with cash on the exact date the phone was activated. The timestamp matched the cash withdrawal from the man's bank account. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was close. The next piece came from technology that hadn't existed 22 years ago. Cell tower data could now be analyzed with much greater precision. The technical team went through the records from that night, tracking not just Diana's phone, but looking for patterns in other phones connecting to the same towers. They found another phone that had been in the area. Not the burner phone, those records were gone, but the man's personal cell phone. It had pinged off the same cell tower as Diana's phone in that mountain area, within minutes of each other. He'd been there. On that road. The same night Diana died. The picture was coming together, but there were still gaps. The lead detective started interviewing people who'd known the man, who'd worked with him on the show. Most barely remembered him. He'd been forgettable, the kind of person who blended into the background, but one person remembered more. Another production assistant who'd worked alongside him. She'd kept in touch with him for a few months after he left Los Angeles. They'd grab coffee occasionally, talk about the industry, about what they were doing next. She told investigators that he'd seemed different after Diana disappeared. Guilty maybe, or scared. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. He'd stopped wanting to talk about the show. He'd get uncomfortable if Diana's name came up in conversation. Eventually, he'd stopped returning her calls and they'd lost touch. She mentioned something else. Once, during one of their last conversations, he'd said something strange. They'd been talking about the investigation into Diana's disappearance, which was still all over the news at that point, and he'd said, almost to himself, that sometimes accidents happen when people make bad choices, that sometimes things go wrong even when you're trying to do the right thing. At the time, she'd thought he was just being philosophical. Now looking back, she wondered if he'd been talking about something specific, something he'd done. The investigators theorized about what might have happened that night. Based on the letters, the phone calls, the cell tower data, they built a timeline. This man had been obsessed with Diana. He'd written her letters that became increasingly personal. He'd somehow gotten her private phone number, probably from production records he had access to. On the night of the party, he'd called her. Maybe he'd told her he had information she needed to hear. Maybe he'd claimed there was an emergency. Maybe he'd threatened to do something if she didn't meet him. Whatever he'd said during those phone calls, it had convinced Diana to drive to that isolated mountain road. The evidence suggested she'd gone there to meet him. But whether she'd gone willingly, thinking she was helping someone in distress, or whether she'd been coerced, they couldn't know for certain. What happened when she got there was also unclear. The forensic evidence from the car showed high-speed impact, suggesting Diana had been driving fast when she went over the edge. Had she been trying to escape? Had she realized she was in danger and tried to flee? Or had something else happened? An argument that went wrong? Had he tried to stop her from leaving and she'd panicked, getting in her car and speeding away without being careful on the unfamiliar road? The investigators found one more piece of evidence. In the archived records from the man's apartment after his death, there was a diary. Most of it was mundane. Daily activities, thoughts about work, nothing remarkable. But there were pages that had been torn out. Several of them, right around the time Diana disappeared. Someone had removed them carefully, probably the man himself. Whatever he'd written during those days, he hadn't wanted anyone to ever read it. The lead detective sat in his office late one night, looking at the evidence board they'd created. Photos of Diana, of the crash site, of the man they believed was responsible. Lines connecting different pieces of evidence. Timeline markers, cell tower maps. They had enough to be confident about what had happened. This man had been obsessed with Diana. He'd lured her to that mountain road. Something had gone wrong, and Diana had died trying to escape. Then he'd fled, spent the rest of his life moving around, never settling down, carrying the guilt of what he'd done until his own death 8 years ago. But could they prove it beyond any doubt? No, too much time had passed. Too much evidence was gone. The only person who could have confirmed their theory was dead. Still, the investigation had given Diana's family something they'd been without for 22 years. Answers. Maybe not complete answers, but enough to understand what had happened to their daughter that night. Enough to know that she hadn't just vanished, that she'd been the victim of someone's obsession and poor judgment. The case files would show one more thing. A notation that the suspect in Diana Marquez's death had been identified but was deceased, ending any possibility of prosecution. The case was solved, even if justice would never be served in a courtroom. Sometimes that's how these stories end. Not with dramatic arrests and trials, but with quiet revelations years after the fact. With pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together when everyone involved has already moved on or passed away. The truth had been buried under 20 feet of mud on a mountainside. Now it was out in the open, painful and incomplete, but finally known.